So, good afternoon. My name is Alan Kratz, and I help communities find funding and financing to adapt to our changing climate. And my focus today is the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Enacted 4 months ago, that act provides $1.9 trillion to, quote, meet pandemic response needs and rebuild a stronger, more equitable economy as the country recovers, end of quotes. That's from the US Treasury. And many of the types of projects eligible for American Rescue Plan Act funding also support efforts to address climate change. So welcome to today's Zoom meeting and discussion. My colleague Stuart Mader, who's a transportation policy expert, is providing technical backup. And Stuart will help me, actually Randy will help watch the chat to admit people. Stuart will help watch the chat so that we have a lively interactive discussion. And please feel free now, if you haven't already done so, to add your affiliation to your name just by using the renaming feature. And I think Stuart has already put some pointers in the chat bar about how to do that. So here's an outline of what we're going to be doing today. First, we'll have a review of what the American Rescue Plan Act is and how we can use it in our own communities. Second, we'll see a few examples of how communities in various states are planning to use American Rescue Plan funding for climate-related projects. And then we'll conclude by discussing steps that your community can take. And those steps include responding to Treasury's request for public comments on their interim final rule by this coming Friday. So that's our three-part agenda. So to get us started, let's acknowledge, and you actually can use the thumbs up in the reactions bar to agree, that all of us are sensing that something is up with our climate. Hotter, drier weather, increasingly intense rain, higher tides and storm surges, a rash of new and increased pest infestations, greater strains on electric power grids, on water supplies, on wastewater treatment plants. Already it's been quite a summer. And here's an additional reality. Whatever public policy issue motivates us personally or on the job, housing, health, hunger, transportation, earning a living from the ocean, earning a living from our inland natural resources, racial equity, economic disparity, climate change will accelerate and intensify and complicate that issue. We also know that climate mitigation can feel hopeless. Adaptation is expensive. Both mitigation and adaptation require significant investments of personal and public resources. So that's why, on a positive note, as a climate funding strategist, I'm really glad that our communities, small and large, are able to benefit from the American Rescue Plan Act that Congress enacted this past March. The American Rescue Plan Act, and I'm going to join others in calling it ARPA, is allocating funds to all states and to all local governments within each state to recover from the financial effects of COVID-19 in 4 areas. You see them on the screen. And included in that list of policy objectives is the exact language from the US Treasury to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. So this is new funding. It's unprecedented in size and scope. And guidance on exactly how communities can use this funding continues to evolve in both Washington and our state capitals. So today's information is the best that I've been able to get from the US Treasury's interim final rule, which is on Treasury's website, and from memos from various state agencies. And Stuart, I know Stuart has already added the link to Treasury's interim final rule in the chat, so you can refer to that later. In addition, I regularly update my Twitter account with news about ARPA and how communities are using it for climate change. Stuart has added that link to the chat, so you can look to my Twitter account for fairly regular updates on that. To give you a sense of how you could equip your community, wherever it is, I'm going to show you how ARPA can help communities in a specific state, the state of Maine. So let's look at the dollar figures. Based on population and unemployment figures and other components of the allocation formula, Maine will receive $4.5 billion. And you see here how it's going to be distributed. About 1 billion, we've got to talk in big numbers here. Almost 1 billion is for the state government to use in ways that the governor and legislature still are addressing. I checked this morning and that's still not determined, but the money will be divided. And here you'll see in green how 10.7 million is going to go to Hancock County, 1.2 million in addition to that is going to 9 Blue Hill Peninsula towns. So here's a further breakdown within the communities in Hancock County, 9 of them on the Blue Hill Peninsula. And these are preliminary figures. Maine's Department of Administrative and Financial Services will finish calculating this list this month. I'm sure in your own communities, you can find your own breakdown. Perhaps you already know what your ARPA funding is. If you'd like help looking at that or finding that, please let me know. But before we look at how funds can be used, here's a quick caveat of how they can't be used. ARPA funds cannot be used for a rainy day financial reserve or for a pension plan or for tax reduction. And that's because ARPA is designed to get money into the economy right away. Also, ARPA cannot be used as the non-federal match for other federal funding programs. However, ARPA funds can be used to be added to other federal funding. They just can't be a substitute. So let's look at what ARPA really can be used for. Treasury provides really clear direction on what types of water and sewer projects qualify for ARPA funding. Essentially, whatever qualifies for EPA loans through a state's Clean Water State Revolving Fund or a state's Drinking Water State Revolving Fund is eligible for ARPA funding. Each state, of course, has a revolving loan fund for water and sewer projects specifies what qualifies. So in Maine, for example, the Clean Water Revolving Fund supports direct impact projects such as those listed here. And isn't this a great list of verbs? Acquire, plan, design, construct, enlarge, repair, improve these facilities that are shown in the list here. Maine's Clean Water State Revolving Fund also finances indirect impact projects. So we as communities have a wide portfolio of eligible clean water projects. And parallel to the Clean Water Fund is the Maine's Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which enables communities to improve or replace the delivery systems that are listed here. Let me just take a minute and really anchor this in language from Treasury's interim final rule. Treasury says that many of the types of projects eligible under either the Clean Water State Revolving Fund or the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund also support efforts to address climate change. For example, by taking steps to manage potential sources of pollution and preventing these sources from reaching sources of drinking water, projects eligible under the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the ARPA may reduce energy required to treat drinking water. Similarly, projects eligible under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund include measures to conserve and reuse water or reduce the energy consumption of public water treatment facilities. And that's from pages 67 to 68 in the interim final rule that you can find thanks to what Stuart has already put in the chat as the link. In your own state, as you build your list of eligible projects, it's really smart to turn to Treasury's specific, clear call out to advance climate change. Here's a direct quote from Treasury's interim final rule. And here it is. Treasury encourages recipients to consider green infrastructure investments and projects to improve resilience to the effects of climate change. And to underscore that point, Treasury proceeds with this elaboration. Green infrastructure could include rain gardens and green streets that delay, store, and discharge rainwater rather than overloading a community's sewer system. So that's Treasury's guidance on adapting to the effects of heavy rain. So how about the reverse? Too little water. Well, that's the example of a natural disaster the Treasury calls out as a permitted use of ARPA funds, interconnecting water systems to mitigate the effects of an extended drought. So before we look at various communities' plans, we've gone to the first part of our agenda here. What does ARPA do? And here's the recap. Treasury's guidance gives our communities wide latitude for water and sewer projects that help us mitigate the effects of climate change and adapt to it. So that's the first part of what we're doing today. Now let's look at what other communities are doing, because it's clear that across the country, communities are following through. Here are the amounts that 6 communities plan to spend on water and sewer upgrades using ARPA funds. This is just a sample of what is out there in the public domain. In this sample, Cleveland Heights in Ohio tops the list, both in dollars and in the percentage of its ARPA allocation that it has said it plans to use for water and sewer projects, nearly 3/4 of its total ARPA allocation. And again, you can find news articles about these plans in my Twitter feed. 2 other points to make. As we plan on how to use ARPA funding, we demonstrate good stewardship of the funding and good stewardship of our community's resilience by incorporating environmental justice. And I emphasize environmental justice because the Environmental Protection Agency is committed to ensuring that the funding for grants and contracts that it oversees, as well as other EPA activities, identify and address disproportionate environmental or public health harms and risks in underserved communities through a range of local initiatives. And in fact, EPA Administrator Michael Regan recently went to Baltimore to announce a series of grants to aid under-resourced communities. And you'll see a link to that article in the chat. We know, said Michael Regan, we know how important it is to put funding to work in environmentally overburdened, economically underserved areas. And today, we're excited to let our communities know that thanks to the American Rescue Plan, help is here. And that's what he said in his speech in Baltimore recently. So a good example of environmental justice is Shreveport, Louisiana. In a recent community meeting about ARPA, Mayor Adrian Perkins reminded community members that water mains burst during freezing weather this past February. Broken mains left the hospital and residents, including low-income residents, without water. So during this recent community meeting, Mayor Perkins said that the city's $48 million allocation could help upgrade the city's sewer system. Similarly, in Missouri, Columbia, Missouri, that city is considering using some of its $40 million to provide wastewater lateral assistance grants for low-income property owners. And in addition to recognizing the fact that the effects of climate change cross economic lines, we also do well to recognize that climate change crosses municipal boundaries. So here are 3 examples of discussion of interlocal cooperation. In Alabama, the city of Montgomery and the surrounding county of Montgomery are discussing how to optimize the value of their allocations by using them jointly. In Idaho, there may be interest in pooling resources in Boise and its surrounding area. And in Texas, there's a similar interest in the opportunity to work jointly on, quote, things that we can do together because everybody's got money. So these 3 examples that I've just cited refer to ARPA spending in general rather than to water and sewer projects specifically. Nonetheless, these government officials are showing the importance of regional planning. And certainly those of us working on climate resilience know how important it is to address climate change beyond municipal boundaries and beyond municipal budgets. So whether our planning is focused on one community or is regional, here are some key dates to keep in mind. ARPA funds must be committed to a project by the end of 2024. Projects must be completed by December 31, 2026. Meanwhile, most immediately this coming Friday is Treasury's deadline for comments on its interim final rule. Treasury is seeking public comments on 4 questions related to ARPA funds for water and sewer projects. The first question relates to the broadness of the water and sewer category. And by the way, I'm using Treasury's numbers from their interim final rule. The second question asks about additional categories to better assist unserved, underserved, and rural communities. The third question focuses on new categories, specifically emerging technologies to support resiliency. Are there different ways that technology can be used, new technology in particular? And the fourth question seeks input on whether dam and reservoir projects should be eligible for ARPA funding. So in a minute, we'll discuss these questions and what else you may wish to ask or tell Treasury during the public comment period that's open now. But first, Here's the portal for its submitting online comments by the close of business this Friday. And Stuart has put that link in the chat. And you can certainly use that. And to prime the pump for our discussion today, the next several slides suggest questions that may be worth asking Treasury. So here's a question that I've heard. Are water and sewer projects eligible for ARPA funding only if they already were planned prior to COVID-19 and were deferred or delayed because of the pandemic? Or alternatively, can ARPA funds be used for new post-pandemic projects? A good question. So Treasury's guidance on other matters refers to acquiring, planning, designing, constructing, enlarging, repairing, and improving water and sewer infrastructure. Can that category be broadened? Can a community use ARPA funding for comprehensive town planning? How about for new technology for planning, for mapping, like remote sensing and drones? Nature-based solutions often are less expensive than hard infrastructure. Are they fundable? Roadway culvert expansions help manage stormwater. Are they a permissible use? The public health of a community might require more than hardening a sewage treatment plant against flooding. And that's because during a natural disaster, communities benefit from uninterrupted service to poor facilities. The ones you see here, supermarkets, pharmacies, medical facilities, fire, police, EMT services, they need that connectivity as well as a functioning water and sewer system. So will ARPA fund generators and a microgrid to connect water and sewer facilities to these essential public services that are essential for public health and well-being during a disaster? Similarly, will ARPA fund new technologies for storing backup power for emergency use in a disaster? Uninterrupted service is particularly important for underserved community members. And we know that environmental justice is an important public policy objective. So will ARPA support assistance to low-income community members for sewer connections, for private wells? Most states have established revolving loan funds for water projects. We mentioned that at the top of the session here. So can a municipality or an intergovernmental entity use ARPA to capitalize its own revolving loan fund? So perhaps these questions have stimulated questions of your own, and we can discuss those in a minute. Meanwhile, here are Treasury's pointers for commenting. They have their rules to comment on the rule. The first is the comments should be addressed to this address, the Treasury. This address will be in the document that you get later today as a recap of today's session. Treasury asks that comments include this subject line, they call it a caption, along with key contact information and, if appropriate, a short executive summary. You can attach standard files up to this limit. So that's an add-on if you want to have something to add to your written comment that goes into the portal. So before we go further into the discussion, I want to just point out two near-term steps plus several follow-up steps. Near term, it's important now to continue to review the guidance from Treasury, from your own state officials. Also work, perhaps you have a professional advocacy group or a trade association that is following this and has some specialized additional information that's pertinent to your community, pertinent to your agency, pertinent to your projects, potential projects. Also, make sure that your municipality has registered with sam.gov. That's the federal government portal for conducting financial matters with the government. So again, all of these are in the chat and you can refer to them there. And then following these near-term steps, it's a good idea to work with or to form a special committee to survey your community, to recommend appropriate projects, and to ensure that marginalized community members can enjoy the full benefit of how our towns decide to administer ARPA with full attention to environmental justice. And because the capital projects that your community may wish to fund take time and must be underway by the end of 2024, that sounds like it's a long way off, but it's not. It really does make good sense to identify projects that already are in the planning phase or the design phase so that they are ready to go with ARPA support. So these are the steps that those of us engaged in climate resilience can take to help realize the full potential of the American Rescue Plan Act. And this act is, I will summarize by saying, a significant opportunity for those of us who care about climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and climate resilience to continue our due diligence and our creative thinking, to work interlocally, and to improve the quality of life for all in our communities. So we have time now for further discussion. You may have some thoughts that you'd like to share. So one of the things you may want to discuss is, can ARPA funds be used for these particular projects? You may have general comments and general questions. And at this point, Stuart is going to swap out this presentation slide and put up a whiteboard for recording your comments, and do that in real time. If there's anything you'd like to add and comment on. So why don't we go for, first of all, while Stuart's getting the whiteboard up, any general questions or any general comments, and you can unmute yourself and you can speak, or you can raise your hand in the reactions button. So who wants to be first? And I'm having trouble seeing the whole screen. Let me see if I can get gallery view up here for a minute and see who wants to speak. Wayne Cobley from GZA would like to comment. Wayne?
Yeah, when we talked before about microgrids, it didn't appear that they were explicitly prevented or encouraged. So when I went to the Treasury comment page, I did notice that there's a button you can hit to search the comments that have already been given by other people. So I did that. I put microgrids in. It showed up only in one letter twice. And I think it was like the National Association of Mayors or something like that. So you were able to go into their letter, download it, see what they said about it, and what references or, documents they had to back up their recommendation, which I did. So I'm starting to prepare my comments that way. But I think that is helpful, because you might have a question or a recommendation and somebody else has it too, or you might find from searching on that site that nobody's even brought it up yet. And I think the best thing for this Friday would be to get as many ideas into the Treasury as possible, so that, if we miss the opportunity now, I think it's forever hold your peace.
Wayne, that's a really good comment. And I'll just say three things about that. The general comment is that, yes, I think the experience has been with the CARES Act that every reinterpretation of that act expanded the eligibility of funding. So I think it's important. That's one value of the public comment period. You mentioned specifically, and I'm really glad you mentioned that one can search and see who else has commented on what. And to your point, in addition to adding comments on a similar topic, I would assume that it's also helpful, and I think you intimated this if you didn't say it directly, refer to someone else's comments. It again creates the network value of multiple comments, and it shows that we're really thinking holistically as a community about how to do these things. So I appreciate your mentioning that. This is really valuable information.
Yeah, what I noticed too is where they recommended addressing microgrids was different than where I was going to recommend it. I thought it would be more appropriate for water and sewer infrastructure or innovative technology, and they had it in under kind of community housing and helping social equity issues. So in a way, it just expands on a comment that's already made that they could benefit in multiple areas of eligibility.
Very good. Thank you. Who else has a comment? Parker Gassett, would you like to ask your question? You're from Maine Sea Grant and University of Maine.
Thanks, Alan. And forgive me, I'm trying to catch up with all the info here. Really happy to chat with you. I'm curious about municipalities who want to hire more staff. Are ARPA funds usable for new positions, or is it only for those structural and implementation costs?
I don't know the answer to that. I would need to research that. That's a good question. And let me do some more research, Parker, and I'll get back to you on that. I know that I've been focused on the climate change aspect of this, but those three other portions of how the funds can be used have very specific guidelines about who can be paid what and how funds are accounted for. And that's beyond what I researched for this purpose, but it's an important question, and I'll follow up.
And almost as a follow-up to that question, if there are creative ways that other towns or cities have said that within a particular project's budget, there is a short-term hire or, an annual salary for someone who is a specific project manager. So rather than a new position for a city or a town, something where the staff is a component of the project budget might be really helpful to have examples from other communities.
Good point. Does anyone on the call, I know there's some people who may already be working on this. Does anybody from a governmental position have any thoughts on that they'd like to share now with Parker, even as a preliminary answer?
Alan, I'm not on a government position, but I know we've already benefited tremendously from the Hancock County Planning Commission, but they are very short-staffed, and that Parker raises a really interesting point about could we build in a part-time or a short-term position for our regional planning commissions as well as our municipalities.
That's good. And Randy, you're from Blue Hills, so you speak from the Hancock County aspect of Maine. That's very helpful.
Yep.
I will throw out, I was recently doing some research on FEMA BRIC funding, and there's a project that's focusing on code enforcement. So that might get to a little bit more of the implementation and salary end of it. And if FEMA's thinking about it, maybe there's maybe sort of precedent for including that in some of the ARPA funding.
Well, thank you very much. Would you like to let people know where you come from or what you're working on now?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Will. I work for Kennebec Valley Council of Governments down in Fairfield. The BRIC conversation came up because I've been working with some municipalities trying to get more buy-in and involvement in NFIP and community, the CRS, community, whatever the FEMA participation is that reduces your flood insurance. But it's really tough because it requires a lot of involvement from code enforcement officials, and that's a pretty regular deficiency when it comes to municipal spending. They don't have the money to hire a full-time code enforcement officer. So using some of the BRIC funding to pay for that would be really valuable. So I'm doing a little bit more research on that.
And Will, I'm going to, I think I remember what these acronyms are. BRIC is Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. If NFIP is National Flood Insurance Program, and CRS, I think you said, I forget what that is. And maybe.
Yeah, FEMA is great for its acronyms.
They should go in the
rating system.
Community rating system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good. So Jim Branford, Jim Finch from Branford, would you like to comment on this? And then I'm going to go to Jeff Milligan after Jim Finch. Jim, would you like to?
Sure. From what I'm hearing and seeing a little
Jim,
bit.
You're the finance director from Branford, just so everybody knows. And I'll just, after you speak, I'll add one more thing about you. Go ahead.
There's some talk among my colleagues, and I've seen a few things on the internet where, you asked about staffing, in terms of tracking compliance and doing a lot of the legwork with these projects. A lot of places I think are looking to do RFPs to hire consultants. So they're not necessarily adding staff to payroll, but they're supplementing their staffs with outside professional services.
That's helpful. And Jim, I just wanted to pick up on one of the things I said in the presentation, which is that although ARPA funds cannot be used to be the non-federal match, they can supplement, they can complement other federal funding. You're somebody who I know is very good at matching and putting together whole packages where one fund leverages another. Have you given some thought, I'm putting you on the spot here, I know, but have you given some thought about how ARPA funds can be combined with other funding that's in play in Branford to achieve climate resilience? Or do you want to speak generally about how to?
Yeah, maybe generally. I mean, the town has, as some folks may know from a previous webinar through, the Resilient Cities Group, has talked about financing some of their resilience efforts. So the town has certain local dollars that we've appropriated for these things, which we can use the federal dollars to augment these efforts. One of the things that when we got our state county allocation, we were pleasantly surprised how large it was. And that actually also got us to look at the other things we may not have looked at before. And one of the things that we're looking at is to basically look at funding protective measures for our sewage treatment plant. Whereas before, the initial dollars were not that large, and now it gives us an opportunity to look at that. So to the extent you are already funding some of these activities and you have funds set aside, we set up a climate change and coastal resiliency fund. So we have those dollars to leverage some of these federal dollars. And but we haven't got into too much detail yet. We're still trying to figure out how we're going to allocate these funds. But clearly there are a lot of different sources out there. And I think getting back to my initial comment about the RFPs, there is no shortage of accounting firms and others that are also can provide assistance in this regard.
And that's a good point. And I know that a number of communities or states are hiring consultants I know Doña Ana County in New Mexico had a consultant come in and help them do the allocation and do it in an equitable way. So yeah, those are among the players in this whole field. So those of you who would like to know how to package funding, I suggest you reach out to Jim Finch. He's really, I've known him to be very good at this. I want to go to Jeff Milligan. Jeff, you had a question about the road. Would you like to articulate that? And then I think that Sandy Gilbraith has something to add to that. Jeff, would you like to raise your question?
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, I think this may be a joint question with me and Sandy. I'm from Blue Hill, Maine. We have a hospital which is planning a major restoration, and it's very close to the high water mark of Blue Hill Harbor. And I'm asking if there's a way that a public-private project could be funded with ARPA funds, such that if the town chose to, we could provide public funds to a project that would include stabilization of a wastewater treatment fund, public access to the hospital, which runs along the waterway, into the project constructing or rebuilding a hospital, replacing a hospital.
Sandy, did you want to respond? Jeff has mentioned you, and I see you have something in the chat. Do you want to expand on that?
Sure. It's a little different, but similar kind of question. There's a road here in Damariscotta that needs a culvert replaced, and it's the only access to a hospital in the area. And even though I think culverts were noted that they were not eligible for ARPA funds, but given that public health and access to healthcare is eligible, we didn't know if maybe that connection with the road could mean that the culvert and replacement for the road would be eligible.
A very good question. And I've got to think that, it certainly makes common sense. I'm certainly not making the rules here. Jeremy Martin, do you want to add in about stream crossing grants? Sandy probably knows about this, but others may want to know what Maine's program is on this. Do you want to chime in on that?
Sure, I can just touch base really quick. I mean, the town of Camden utilized a stream crossing grant that was funded with bond funds that were voted on by voters a number of years ago. I would, if I was down in Damariscotta, that's where I would be looking for stream crossing grants from DEP. They'll cover upwards of $95,000 or so on a stream crossing culvert project, as long as it's an open bottom culvert replacement. So that's what I would look there for funds.
Jeremy, you're the planner and the development officer for Camden, Maine. Is that correct? Do I recall correctly?
That is correct. Yes, sir.
Good. Well, thank you for that that input.
Absolutely.
And Will Harper, I think, has just put in a link to that, the Stream Crossing Grant Program. So Will, thank you very much for that. I'm looking at the chat here to see if I've missed anybody. I see Parker, you've helpfully defined community rating system, which, as you add here, is a cost reduction program on federal flood insurance rates. And that's, one of the questions that I've had. A lot of these flood insurance maps need updating. Will ARPA funds be used for that? Typically, that's done on a letter amendment basis, but I'm wondering if there will be a more wholesale view of flood insurance mapping, because that certainly, as you point out, it can be used to reduce flood insurance rates. And let's see. Kathy, you asked, will this file be available after? By file, I'll answer and say yes. We'll make this PowerPoint. I will send the PowerPoint out later today. It'll have my notes on the bottom. And Stuart and I will put together the file that he's working on here in real time. That'll go out. And then we will have this recording up on the web. And I will announce that in the next newsletter that I do, which will be next Thursday. I always do that on the 4th Thursday of the month, which is next. It's from the 22nd, and I'll include a link there. So you'll have all of those 3 things for following up. So who else has a comment or question? Any general comments about ARPA? Has anybody been starting thinking? Anybody have a community meeting so far? Or, communities have been doing a number of things. Some communities have had a website. They've had online surveys. I guess it was on SurveyMonkey or maybe something else. Have any of your communities been to that point yet or not?
It looked like raised hands from Jeremy Martin and Randy Curtis.
Thank you. So Jeremy and then Randy.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment about the FEMA flood maps. The state of Maine, Sue Baker, the floodplain management program, they do have their map modernization program in place, and they are updating and upgrading those maps as quickly as possible. So I do know that's happening. I don't know if the state's going to be utilizing any of these federal funds to do that. I know they had a plan in place to update them and upgrade them, and they are moving forward with that. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. That's good news. Is that up and down the coast? Or is that locality by locality, or how extensive is that going to be?
It's statewide, but I think they're picking off the southern part of the state first. But Sue is the one to talk to on that, and they are doing it region by region or county by county for the most part.
Very good. Thank you.
Yep.
Jeff, you had your hand up, I think, or Randy did. One of you did.
Yeah, I did.
Randy,
Jeff,
thank you.
Jeff was holding his head. I guess he has a headache.
Oh, the topic's not that bad, is it?
No.
Well, he met with the hospital this morning, so that they may have confused this whole issue. But yes, here in Blue Hill Peninsula, we've somehow managed, thanks a lot to Alan for providing a lot of the content and facilitation skills into the Island Institute, to get the 9 towns on the Blue Hill Peninsula operating under the umbrella of Peninsula Tomorrow, and trying to explore what are activities that we could do regionally and get funded for, because they're regional and there are priorities that really need to be addressed on a regional basis. And then what are priorities that we will have to fund individually, but could benefit from feedback from our neighboring towns. So it's been a fascinating process, and we look forward to further guidance. And one of the questions I wanted to ask this group was whether anybody's heard when Maine Municipal Association will have further guidance on how to access this funding. We understand there's a contractor that's been hired by the state to handle disbursements from the towns. And I imagine we probably won't hear a lot from anybody that's definitive until Treasury processes all these comments. And I don't know if they've given themselves a deadline on when that's going to be available.
There was an email that came out this morning I saw from Maine Municipal. I don't know if anyone else got it. I didn't get a chance to read it yet on this issue.
So Randy, I think, yeah, that's certainly a good question. And it's not clear to me, Wayne, you may be deeper into the Treasury process than I am. I'm not sure that the allocations will wait until Treasury digests all of the public comments coming in. My guess is that it will be an iterative process where Treasury will continue interpreting and sending out new guidance. And my conjecture is that in the meantime, the allocations will be finalized in Maine by the the Department of Administrative and Financial Services. And that will be an initial go-ahead for communities. That's just my sense of having watched how government works before. Wayne, do you want to, or anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think you're right, Alan. I know they want to get the guidance out quickly. So I would imagine the stuff that's easy for them to say, this is clearly ineligible, to come out with real quick. And then the things that people are suggesting they add, there might take a little bit more time just to make sure it's a valid need.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You know?
So I think my takeaway is for us in our communities, we need to get started. First of all, with the comments that we're formulating and we're embellishing with the value of this conversation. And then really it's important to start working on likely projects. So I don't know if there's anyone else who would like to comment or have a question.
Parker has his hand.
Hi, Parker. I didn't see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Alan, if for kind of broad insight here, a lot of small communities they're really used to being frugal when necessary and being really self-reliant when necessary. And when a big opportunity for a lot of funding comes in, there can be this like accidental, use up the funds really quickly. And at the end of the 2 or 3 years, suddenly you think, how did we go through $1 million and only made these few projects happen? And so just wondered about your insight on, with freshly available large amounts of funds, how do you still really make sure that you're getting the best use out of those when some of these communities have a history of doing a lot with only a little bit?
What I've observed, and I've been reading, as I mentioned, I've been reading the news about this. I think 2 things come into play. One is I see a lot of communities doing a community survey in the form of an online survey, listening sessions, hearing-like meetings, and that's a way of really getting good public input. The second piece of that is I've seen public officials say we need to really make sure that we're doing projects that have staying power, projects that fulfill the congressional intent, and projects that aren't going to burden us with operation and maintenance costs beyond the lifetime of this funding. So that's one of the key things here. Needs to be a project that is both valuable and sustainable. And you raise a good point. This is a huge amount of money, and it's a windfall for many of us. And it really does require a good way of being careful. How are we as communities careful with other sources of fund? I think we have to import that or export that to this topic as well. I don't know if that answers that, but you really do raise a good question. I think it's going to be a challenge, a good challenge for many of us in our communities. How do we do this in a responsible way? Do you want to say more on that?
Just noticing in the chat, Kathy put in this great toolkit, maybe from Connecticut communities. I'm just looking at it now.
Yeah, Kathy, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah,
Parker.
yep, the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities put together a group that included a couple associations like the Business Council and other groups, economic development groups, to put together a toolkit to help municipalities figure out, to Parker's point, we have this influx of funds. We can either transform our communities with one project or something like that, or we can do this sort of Band-Aid approach on others, and what's the best use. And so they sort of put that together with some sort of best practices on, you know, if you do have a project, you know, when the fund's over, make sure you have staffing to support it, and sort of just some key takeaways that I think might be really helpful. They've tried to, you know, work with the municipalities on that. I also, Alan, had a question I posted earlier about funding roads, and there was, like, on page 60 of the 200 or 300 page document, there was like one paragraph in there, and it spoke to, you know, using the funds for other things that aren't just the broadband and water and wastewater, and it threw it in there like environmental remediation and roads and a couple other things. And so I'm just wondering if you're hearing others using the funds for infrastructure projects that aren't specifically tied to water and wastewater.
I've not, and I very much appreciate your highlighting this. I mean, this proves the value of looking at what every line in the interim final rule. There are things there that are not intentionally hidden, but that are part of the legislative process that can provide a springboard for what we want to do. So thank you for pointing that out. I'm glad that's in the chat. And it does look like it could help some of the things that we've been talking about this afternoon. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for the resource that comes out of Connecticut as well.
Welcome.
Sandy, you put something in the chat. Would you like to verbalize that or elaborate on that? I know chat often is, you know, somewhat truncated and truncates what we want to say. So if you'd like to elaborate, this is a good opportunity.
Sure. We were just talking about different ways that county or municipalities and governments are engaging their residents and trying to understand needs and how to, you know, use these funds in the best way. And just wanted to share that Lincoln County is working through a process to identify how to spend county funds. So not quite 100% applicable to the municipal conversation, but we're engaging municipalities very intentionally along with local legislators and identified organizational stakeholders about what would be useful for their towns or their organizations, as well as systemic issues that could be addressed through this one-time injection of a large amount of funds. So we're really trying to be as use the funds in the best way and be as impactful as we can.
Cool. That sounds very good. And 3 more workshops scheduled through August. Wonderful. Well, thank you. Is there anyone else? I know we're coming up toward the top of the hour, and we can give ourselves back some time if you wish. If there's anyone else who'd like to comment, make any concluding comments, that would be fine. If not, I just want to thank all of you for being involved in this issue, for thinking clearly, for thinking proactively, for thinking sensitively about how we do this. This is a great opportunity. And as I said at the top of the hour, you know, whatever our particular issue is, vocationally or personally, climate change is going to intensify it, accelerate it, complicate it. And I'm so glad we have the opportunity in the American Rescue Plan Act to use some of the money in an equitable, environmentally sensitive, economically justice way to advance climate resilience. And John Peacock asks, when will this recording be available? We'll get it up on YouTube as soon as possible, and I'll announce that in the next issue of Resilience Works Monthly, which will be coming out next Thursday, and it'll have a link to the recording for those of you who want to share it with colleagues, or my heavens, look at it again if it's useful. So just checking the chat, and it looks like that's it. Stuart, do you have any comments? You've been very helpful here. Do you want to add anything to what we're saying here?
I think this has been an excellent discussion. We're tracking all the various questions and topics on that last slide, and we'll make sure to include that in the materials that are sent around afterward.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, Stuart, were we able to capture things, some of the links that were in the chat from for instance, Sandy's and Kathy's things? Are those retrievable?
Yes, I'll add those in.
Okay, wonderful. That's why you're the tech expert. Thank you very much. Well, look, thank you everyone for joining in this afternoon, and let's hope for good interpretations from Treasury. Let's hope for good. We'll make this plan work for all of us. So thank you so much for all of your time.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.